it's a bigger. It feels like it's a bigger game when you write an English. There's a bigger audience and you have to kind of see a bit more.
But also because I think I'm within that sort of English pastoral rural tradition, and the other two readers tonight, Jess and Kate, are also interested in, I suppose it expresses itself through an interest in the natural world, the landscape, any kind of nationalism. It's just about the tradition of writing, really. So I'm going to start with a poem about the English poet Edward Thomas, who some of you may know. He was a young man just before the First World War, and all he ever wanted to do was write, and he actually earned his living from journalism and criticism. But he also, his first big writing venture was that he wrote topographies of England. So there are actually some fantastic books by Edward Thomas about, one's called The South Country, where he writes about a walk through the South Downs. And the one that I discovered was one he wrote called about the Icknield Way, which is a chalk track which goes all the way from the bottom of the Peddars Way in Norfolk, drops down Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, and ends sort of on the end of Oxfordshire. And the track's still there actually, and it is just a chalk track. And I was really delighted because I kind of found the Icknield Way book, and then I realised that Edward Thomas had walked near my house. So this is called Meeting Edward Thomas on the Icknield Way. I found the track by accident one morning at the back of the wood. A backbone carved of stones, a chalk tyre tread making the miles seem easy. The dog went far ahead, a small lodestar, everything splintering, resisting the tightness of frost. The warmth of another breath was there, wool shirt, tweed jacket, rucksack, leather of boots. I thought I might catch up, but there was no one between the black of winter hedges that closed us in and held the path. Perhaps it was white light, an orange sun that lent itself to ghosts, murmurs of other walkers blessing the freezing air. But something was given in the track, appearing suddenly, and the next day finding the book where he'd noticed each turn and slip of the road, asking whoever followed to look again at leaf fall, bright berries, the hidden shape of places, marks of stone as he walked east to west on a pilgrimage across the chiselled heath which promised all the sky. He must have imprinted air with the weight of thought, his movement of hands. Everything seemed so close to how he found it, in that moment that was falling out of cold into spring, which had never been history and had always been there, if we had chosen to see it. And here's another portrait poem. I like writing portraits of people. This book. This is called Esther and the Hawthorns. She taught us the myths of trees. Ash flowering before oak meant a summer full of Max. An apple rind thrown over your shoulder would spell the initial of your first love's name. There was a lot of weather to keep from the door. 2 brothers drowned in the First War. Her lover disappeared in mud at Ypres. Uneasy captains with black armbands arrived like wasps at harvest. From her I learned the healing power of dock, how to make grass flutes, which berries not to eat, the use of hazel to find water's direction, never to bring hawthorn into the house. A countrywoman like a tree, deep-rooted, full of its lore. I have one photograph of her, hair pinned in a roll, feet laced in sensible black shoes, sitting on the step of her father's farm where she remained. Half smiling, beautiful, she blinks out of the frame. In her hand a horseshoe, perhaps to hold the luck she made from the count of cherry stones. Her naming and shorthand for survival, her stay against the randomness of rain. That's really a poem about superstition, folklore, superstitions. I live just outside Cambridge, southwest going towards Royston, where there's a kind of, it's all incredibly flat, and there are lots, all the fields have ditches, and then that kind of falls into the chalk downland in Royston, really. I lived in the north for a long time, and so there was, when we came here, I felt a real clash of cultures, really, entirely. It's so different. So I'm going to read a poem about a field near my house, and it's called Vanishing Point. On North End Field at the crossroads, behind an ancient chestnut tree, a gate opens onto 10 acres, stretching toward an eastward slipping road. I go there when I'm unsure. A green tunnel of trees opens to where the wind blows a straight path. Here's where Tudor kings listened to larks that still sing heedlessly, staking their ground between a seed factory and a black barn. Never far from water, there's a chalk stream, tracing the sound of rain over gravel and disappearing into land so flat it's an entirely empty page. Under my feet, silver coins were discovered in the parsnip furrows. There is nothing to fence me in but air and sky. Out here in the world, it's just an ordinary day. Somewhere behind me a window opens and ditches trace the edges of the vista. Wires sing along the hedges. In the distance, 2 horses canter away through the long grass at Vanishing Point. There's a field near us where they grow sunflowers commercially, which is absolutely fantastic when you walk past it, because it's just this wonderful golden yellow and orange, and it's so rich, and I always just want to plunge into it, really. So I'm going to read a poem about sunflowers, which aren't native to this country, and it's imagining the person who owns the farm. Sunflowers. How he came to love them, he is not sure. Deep brown pools of seed, a tiger's eye. All the words for yellow are never quite enough. Cinnamon, saffron, daffodil, does not name them. Too faint and moon close for their practicality. Bronze comes closest, forged out of dust and clay, carved into decades surviving desert storms. Or gold, a true colour, with its own alchemy to make the heart of daisies, wasps' casings, thick sugar melt of honey firecracker, a Catherine wheel, their heads as high as his shoulders when he walks the rows. Their deep amber eyes keep him in acres, the strangeness of miles of them, helianthus, somewhere shimmering, seen from a passing train. Like a memory of plains where he might have been a painter, walking barefoot through stubble fields. Now he's a merchant of the sun, servant to all those who reach for it, his harvest horses, the blonde colour of his children's hair, armfuls for city dwellers, so that summer can take them across heavy furrows into the frames of fields, their coins in return for light-woven petals, Picasso parasol, topaz ring, straw-matted circle, canary, butter, parchment, pods. I'm going to read some poems about what I thought of this afternoon as wildnesses, because we seem to be losing our wildernesses and our wild. There's a lot of concern about it. And I'm also aware that this landscape here is so much more gentle and subtle than the landscape of the north, which is elemental and fiery and full of wind and rain. So I thought I'd start off this little section with a poem about feeling northern, which seems to happen between Doncaster and Peterborough. You're on the station in Doncaster and everybody's sort of got dogs on a string and they're all, I'm not talking about stereotypes, but then suddenly, just before Peterborough, you're kind of plunged into this Arcadian world of willow trees and a river and boats and cathedrals. So I'm going to read you my poem about that. If I can find it. It's called Northerners. We have sewn into our pockets a memory of moors and marsh, cathedrals of space, crab towns where stone quays push black water back and the distance is pin-cushioned with lights. Our history, a miner's helmet, echo and reply on mountains, the wild view in the mirror, warehouses turned to gallery space, Blackpool in holiday week, iron bridges and brass bands. Our voices burr with Anglo-Saxon vowels, imprinted so long ago, they remain embedded like diamante studs, hoop earrings, the glamour of hair dyed blonde, dreadlocks, the jostle of pubs selling cheap meals for two, where men off night shift blink above pints, or kindly as carpenters would, railway guards calling goodbye love when the train is pulling for home. We know geology and winter gardens, variety and mosques, chimney smoke yards, rain that half moons cobbles, turning them to silver, the silence you can hear at night outside solitary farms. Some of our novelists wrote in a tiny hand in miniature books. Our grandparents worked at the furnace and the loom, spinning steel and cotton for bread. When we meet, we may talk of hoolies and weather, speak the memory of coastal places, so remote they have forgotten their names. Resorts with rustic piers, where we have been blown inward, but for 20 pence in the telescope, below the spangled lights, beyond the shipping lanes, there are white horses and new harbours, a stretching coast, a different view. I'm going to read this poem about a garden which is near, again, to where I live now, and it's a beautiful place. It's called Dockwra's Manor, and it's in the village of Shepworth, and it's an old Georgian house, and in the garden it's a tiny garden, but it's been split up into courtyards and wild gardens, and it's just a really lovely place to go. And in one of their sheds there's a wooden stone that's got all mornings and mysteries carved into it, which I think is a nice sentiment. I'm not a morning person. I'm sure the person who carved it meant it as a kind of ecstatic, mysterious experience, but this is called June at Dockwra's Manor. The courtyard is a snatch of a far country. The paving stones absorb heat from the sun. Water lilts of the sea and a quenched thirst. Here is for fig and lavender to grow, and rosemary, its rust taste, strong as honey. There might be lemons or a jasmine-covered wall. Enclosed, we sit here in summer, pretending we are high in the mountains, tin bells of goats at the edge of hearing in the clear air. The lily pollen on my hands soaks a rain charm. Slowly the grass is dry, and the heads of artichokes burn among the green. Swallows arrive with high calls and indigo wings. In their returning, they dart between doors, sit high in the eaves, studying the day. This is one way to bring the distance home. I sit on this terrace, half awake, sun behind my eyes. In the daylight's unravelling, what language should I speak? And I'm just going to read two more. Going back to my wildnesses. because I've been running a workshop called Nature Writing in the City in Cambridge, and we go and visit in a city wild places, the river, the nature reserve, Mill Road, cemetery and things. So this is a poem called The Field, which I wrote for a friend of mine, and it was when I was still living in Cumbria in the north. The field has never been cut. He drives past it every day, waits for those afternoons in June when it is full of fritillary and eyebright, bugle and buttercups, flowers that have seeded themselves, blown in from the road. He thinks he should become an amateur naturalist, note the date of the first star-flower, and when the rosebay signals that the year is turning to dewed webs in the grass. Privately, he calls it the burning field. It seems to flicker every golden colour, and he could paint it from memory. He trespasses with his children regularly. Emerging from the wood at the bottom, they lie down among the couch grass heads that point to heaven and wait to feel the earth turning. Among buildings and in cities, he returns to the endless blue, the way the field waits under snow, and then suddenly is full of ladybirds and green. The field stays with him, a wild meadow, always returning summer, where his daughter chases butterflies and grass seed drops in sandwiches, and he lies head to head with his son, pretending to be Indians. He thinks that paradise might be like that. Thank you. And now it's over to Jess.
West Yorkshire, on the edge of the Dales, really. So there's also it's interesting. There's similar themes of the kind of the differences between the wild north and the beautiful big skies of Cambridgeshire. So I'll start with this, and then I'll say a bit more about the other poems to come. Let the day. And the alarm shrills into her dream. A hammer glancing off steel, a gull shrieking to be let in at a back-to-front window she tumbles through into a blur of early light. The bathroom is angular, a cold compress to her sleep-tender skin. Water, too, is unwelcome, its removal half-hearted, a towel like a fist refusing to uncurl. Yesterday's clothes and a dog to be walked and keys to be found, the wind grabs at her as she slams the door and trudges to the patchy woodland edging the estate, where pigeons crack the air in a sudden urge to leave, and blackberry and elder thrum their dark sweetness over the clink of brick on brick, the song of diggers. Day by day, a little less room for the flurry and scramble of unseen creatures, for the stalking ivy and pushy birch. She leans down, turns the fallen apple with the toe of her boot. See how its heart is opened to the forgiving ground. And this next one is, very particularly learning to love the big skies of Cambridgeshire. And it's called Too Much Sky. We trudge through air like setting cement, each boot print a muddy hallmark to the silk screen of leaves at our feet. The river drives out straight from these few trees, channeling across a landscape unwilling to rise above itself. I must unlearn the fells, the drag of cloud over moorland, the swollen fever of a river in spate. Flattened under a fish-eye sky, our words are stretched thin as tin plate. A steel upright of heron is all the perpendicular we have, until that too is gone, tilting on pterodactyl wings. Red umbrella. Some days this red umbrella is more real to me than rain, its weight in my hand, its neat circumference enclosing me. Days when light waltzes in and catches me off guard, gathers me to itself in steps we have danced before. I want an empty coffee cup to hold some meaning. This plate of apple peelings to be a compass point. On the hill above the town you ask me where the shadows fall. Which cloud is this that patterns the fields at our feet? At night, the lit frame of the window blind is a backdrop to my imagined deaths, each more luminous than the next. I know a doorway is close by. I hear the rustle of feathered wings, but I cannot find the catch. Glowstone. When the sky still carries night on its shoulders and all our dreams are underground, you might see a woman walk through the doors of a department store and cross its vast expanse at speed. She hurries past rows of colour-coded fashion, lit as if by an approaching storm, and heads for one of those doors marked private or no entry at the back of women's hosiery. Today, behind that door, there is no storeroom stacked with boxes, no cleaner's disarray of mops and pails. She steps through onto wet rock, curving away beneath her, flowstone caught in billowed shapes, feathered columns rising. Her breath echoes back to her as she kicks off her town-heeled shoes and walks barefoot into darkness. Here in the silence, she will carve solace from the rock, draw light through the soles of her aching feet. So that's part of a series where I found myself writing a lot about landscape, more as a psychological backdrop, I guess, and found myself writing a lot about kind of going down into the depths. So these next ones kind of touch on that. Diving. You may feel me as a ripple beneath your feet, a tremor, a parting of grass stalks that shiver and return to stillness. I'm swimming just below the surface, sweeping back armfuls of tree roots and animal bones in my wake. The crown of my head is an earth mover. My hands slice through clay, legs kick out at rock and feel it crumble. The woman's body that walks beside you is empty. Do not reach out to it. Her soul is in my mouth and swimming with me. And here's another about the kind of that sort of dislocation, I guess. Sun touches my face, but I cannot feel it. Voices elongate and fade. I am drilling through the ironwork of that bridge, slaloming its railings. I slice into concrete and taste the true consistency of stone. I'm trying to stitch myself back into this day, but the needle slips and I am still unravelling. This one is a poem in reference to Stanley Spencer, a very English painter, and it's called Separating Fighting Swans. I don't know whether you're aware of anyone who's familiar with that painting. Separating Fighting Swans. These angels are like housewives at the kitchen door, gossiping over a fence and complaining of bad backs and impetigo, of never-ending chores. On this, their umpteenth appointment of the day, they want only for it to be over, their ample knees digging into the towpath, their arms heavy with holding up the troubled air. Ballooned in their Sunday best, they seem hardly to notice the swans with their necks taut as ship knots, or the man who, prostrate at their feet, reaches into the chaos of wing and feather, as if his hands alone could save us all. I've been writing recently about an 18th century astronomer. So I'm very interested in astronomy. I go a lot to the Institute of Astronomy evenings in the winter. And I came across this woman called Caroline Herschel, who was German but lived in this country most of her life. And her brother William Herschel was famous for making huge advances in astronomy at the time. Invented telescopes. He was the first person to find the planet Uranus. And Caroline was a very important part of his work, but she was very much in his shadow. But she was a very dedicated astronomer that went on to discover quite a lot of comets in her own right as well, and she won medals. But she's still not very well known this time. And I was interested in writing about the landscape of the skies and about using her life as a kind of inspiration. So these are quite early poems that are coming out of that journey. So Caroline was, as a child, she had smallpox and also typhus, and she ended up with a very disfigured face and was she never grew very tall because of that. So her family basically wrote her off and decided that she should just be a family servant and would never marry. But her brother William had other ideas and actually brought her to England in her early 20s. But she'd never been away from home, she'd never known anything other than just being her mother's servant. So this is called Caroline is Brought to England. This past week I have hardly slept. The sky has cast out its demons to frolic, laughing on our heads. Stripped of the simple fabric of my days, I have become a wraith, an insubstantial thing. I float untethered above the tilting deck, feel my heart list towards home. And later, as she became a very dedicated assistant for William, she would take notes while he was doing the stargazing. She would be writing down all the information. And to begin with, she would actually be inside while he was outside on the telescope. In the giant dark of the room, a figure resolves in two pools of light. Her moon-wrecked face, a child's curvature of spine, intricate hands still cooling, reforming, from housemaid to scribe. She waits for a tug of string, the window flung open, her brother's words falling onto her page. As if she herself could pluck from the night's long limbs the body of a star and drop it, fully formed, into her lap. And so the Caroline comets were an important thing. Like I said, she actually discovered 8 comets, which is very unusual at the time. And I think we all saw a lot of comets last year with the whole thing about the Philae landing on the comet. And I don't know whether you ever saw some of the images that were taken, but they're very striking. There's a huge amount of rock. So I'll just end with this short poem. What is this thing called comet? To Caroline, a blur weighted with significance, an unfixed star set loose to roam. To us, a giant brazenly lit, each crater and scar as knowable as our own imperfect skin. Thank you.
So we're going to have a break for about 15-20 minutes. If you want to carry on drinking wine, if you want more wine, just let me know. And there's plates there. And get stuck into the food.
A friend of ours might actually turn up halfway through. I don't know what it is. Well, apparently she came, but because it didn't start, she went away again.
Wait a minute, so what do you want to wait?
Yeah.
No, I think she'll probably now just turn up afterwards. But I did say it'll be fine. Okay, I'm going to start. So I'm not a poet. I feel like I'm here under false pretenses. But I am a northerner, by coincidence, I suppose. In fact, Clare and I actually met in northeast Cumbria 20-something years ago. 25. Blimey. Yes. Anyway, for the last 2 years, I've been writer in residence at the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge. It was supposed to be a year, and it stretched, really. And my intention for the year, was to be a year, was to keep a record of that year and to do something rather different with the journal, as in the sense of a writer's journal or a garden journal. And what
because I have been primarily a writer of fiction, what has emerged is a collection of short stories inspired by the garden, loosely inspired by the garden, one for each month, linked with short descriptive pieces, non-fiction pieces. And what I'm going to read tonight is a request, special request. I don't do requests actually, but Claire twisted my arm. So what I tend to read is bits. I tend to try and give people a sort of taste of the range, because the stories are quite different from each other and the non-fiction pieces are different again. But Claire put in a plea for a whole story, and it works quite well actually, because the story that I'm going to read is the story for June, actually midsummer, so we're not quite there, but very close. And before that, I'm going to read a short non-fiction piece.
Is it not? Can you just hold on 1 second? What is it?
I can.
Wait. Do you want cold or?
Yeah, cold, yeah.
Okay.
And it was inspired really by Foxgloves and Violets, which is the non-fiction piece. And I'm going to read an extract from that first, and then the whole of the short story. It's a bit of fluff really. I have to say it's not the kind of story I write normally, but anyway. So we'll begin.
Well, that's probably why we all want to know what happened.
We start in the real world, Foxgloves and Violets. I wrote this June 2 years ago, I think. June and foxgloves are everywhere. The whites dip and sway in the shade by the brookside entrance, above the blues and purples of lavender and geranium. Near the station road gate, the pinks predominate, from a near white rose through candy floss and salmon to crimson. Never still, the straight-backed stems stand tall or flop sideways, and their hoods, tapering into their sepaled clasp or calyx, the individual tubular flowers bell at the open end into a frill. Inside, a spatter of colour, sometimes reflecting the colour of the cup, as in the deep pinks. Sometimes there's a dramatic contrast, as in those whose white bell contains a crimson splash. Somewhere near the other end of the botanical spectrum sits the violet, contrast in size and habit as well as manner. The name refers to a range of plants including African violets and dog's tooth violets, but particularly to species in the genus Viola in the family Violaceae. The wood violet, or sweet violet, is the derivation of the phrase shrinking violet, denoting shyness or modesty, a far cry from the brashness of the foxglove. And this is probably the original of the nodding violet that Shakespeare included in the list of flowers on the bank where the wild thyme blows in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Its strong fragrance led to its use in making perfumes. Locally, the rare fen violet has recently been rediscovered at Wicken Fen after a decade-long absence. The seeds can lie dormant for years and will only grow when the ground is disturbed and the weather conditions are right. This delicate plant, which is only found at 2 other sites in the UK, was first seen at Wicken Fen in 1860 and was rediscovered in the 80s after vanishing for 30 years. It is, I've never seen this, but it does sound beautiful. It is, according to Richard Maybe, perhaps the most beautiful of all the native violets, the mottled bluish-white flowers often suffused with a mother-of-pearl sheen. Culpeper described the violet as a fine, pleasing plant of Venus, of a mild nature, no way hurtful, and saw its cooling properties as invaluable in the treatment of pains in the head, choleric humours, quinsy, pleurisy, hot rheums, hoarseness in the throat, the heat and sharpness of urine, and for the piles also, being fried with yolks of eggs and applied thereto. Viola tricolor, heartsease, the wild pansy, has a long history of use in herbalism. It's been recommended, amongst other applications, for epilepsy, asthma, skin diseases and eczema, chest complaints, such as bronchitis and whooping cough, and as a diuretic, leading to its use in treating rheumatism and cystitis. Culpeper was less impressed by heartsease, however, which he dismissed as cold, viscous and slimy, although he did concede it was an excellent cure for the French pox. Is this the other side of the same coin that renders the wild pansy a love token, or even a love potion, as evidenced by its rich vein of common names? Kiss behind the garden gate, Jack jump up and kiss me, Johnny jump up, pink of my John, call me to you, Pansy from Ponce, Venus's looking glass, tickle my fancy, and most delightful, meet her in the entry, kiss her in the buttery. Some see in the pansy the shape of a face or two faces, lips kissing in a hood formed by the upper petals. Alternatively, the three lower petals represent a woman between two lovers, hence three faces under a hood, or love in idleness, as in foolish or fruitless love. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Oberon sends Puck to search for the little western flower, once white and now purple with love's wound, where Cupid's arrow fell. Shakespeare's love in idleness has magic properties. Lay its juice on sleeping eyelids, and it will make the sleeper madly dote on the person seen on waking. So the story is called Heartsease. It begins with the wound. The cut, 1/2 centimetre at most, barely breaks the skin, but there is a drop of blood, a ruby bead on the finger. It's June, the early sun already warm on the walls of the great hall. He lays the rake on top of the wheelbarrow of weeds when she cries out and comes over to her. It's nothing, she says, and indeed, once she's wiped away the droplet, it's gone, though a thin mark, not much more than a scratch, remains. They can be vicious, those thorns, he says. His voice is low, an accent she can't place. He appears to consider her, the rosebush, a robin bobbing on the path at their feet, before nodding and returning to the weeding. She watches his back stretch and dip and stretch again, the twist of the torso as he throws a clump of greenery into the barrow. She's still resting the sore finger in the palm of her left hand. It begins with a glance, that voice again, half heard, the flutter of a breath on the back of her neck. At dusk, the shadows lengthen, the air bruised but suddenly full of fragrance, lavender maybe, sage, something sweeter. The temperature drops quickly now that the sun has gone, and the gardens begin to empty as the others drift in to dinner. Charles is anxious to secure his place at the table. She makes some excuse. She loiters with the last of the smokers, and when they head inside too, she walks instead across the cushioned lawn towards the river and leans on the balustrade. The warmth of the sun lingers in the stone. She feels it through the flimsy stuff of her sleeves. A punt passes, the suck of the pole, the swish of water against the sides of the boat, voices, the laughter of a mallard from somewhere on the opposite bank. She waits, the chuckle of water at her feet, for his touch on her shoulders, on her hair. It begins with a little midsummer magic, the spore of something other born on the breeze. You glimpse a thread of silk adrift in the summery air. It seems as if it will pass you by, but look, already you're caught fast. In the great hall, there was an attempt at enchantment, or at any rate an atmosphere. Candles flickered between dishes of vegetables cooling to a jellied mass. Lamps cast a murky light. The clamour of 100 or so voices competing for ear space battered her head. The bœuf bourguignon had left a bloody trail across the tablecloth and a meaty tang in the air. It settled ominously in the stomach. The claret hung heavy in the glass. And now cherry pie. Violet felt herself sinking under the weight. Delicious, the man on her left, a guest of the master, she thought, dabbed at his face with his napkin. Violet nodded, aware that Charles was fidgeting to her right, feeling between the folds of his gown in one pocket after another. He half turned in his seat to face her. What now? Violet! His voice rose above the chatter of those nearest, so that one or two paused and looked in their direction. Charles produced a small square box, which he placed on the cloth in front of him. I hope, that is, I think, he frowned at her, as if she'd already disagreed with whatever he was about to say. Perhaps I should have waited, that is, until we were alone, or at least Violet squirmed in her seat. Dear, infuriating Charles. She watched as 2 red spots appeared on the prominent cheekbones. Noticed, as she always did in these significant moments, the way his long nose hung over his upper lip at the tip, his hair thinning at the temples. But I wanted to take this opportunity. He touched the box with a long finger, and suddenly Violet knew. Indeed, it was obvious. Look at the way their neighbours were downing spoons and forks and leaning towards them, smiling encouragement. She shook her head. Despite the dithering, though, he was unstoppable. Since we have, for some time... What? Violet thought. What have we? It has been some time, yes, an incredible 2.5 years almost. Long past the moment when this kind of surprise might have been acceptable. Charming, even, in its antiquated way. She brushed at a cobweb on her sleeve. And so, Charles looked down briefly, as if checking his notes before bringing the lecture to a close. No, it was too much. Violet stood, pushing her chair back with such force that it clattered to the floor. Mumbling something about the need for fresh air, she pushed her way out of the dining room. It's impossible, Violet said again, striking out towards the river for a 3rd time. Ruth struggled to keep up. I don't see why you're so surprised, Ruth said. I mean, we've all long since given up trying to persuade you to ditch him. You've seemed so settled or stubborn. Well, Violet turned abruptly at the hedge, then stopped, closed her eyes, lifted her head and breathed in, and again, heavenly. The intense sense of nicotiana and wisteria mingled with the sweetness from the rose beds. Although it was after 10, there was still a lightness in the sky across the river to the west. Should we go back in? It's not an evening to be inside. Let's sit for a little. She led the way, and shrugging off her gown and leaving it where it fell on the lawn, she clambered onto the parapet, pulling Ruth up after her. They sat in silence for a while, legs dangling over the water. So, what? Ruth said eventually. Is this just what, a case of nerves? Or have you finally seen sense? He's a complete dinosaur. His attitudes to women, to scholarship, everything, and he's too old for you, way too old. So, you're not going to marry him after all. You're going to do the sensible thing and what? Travel? Apply for a senior post somewhere? Violet didn't reply, letting the noises of the night wash over her. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of fireworks. A May ball at one of the outlying colleges, she supposed, and intermittent shrieks and laughter, and the clink of bottles as 2 punts bumped their way past below them. If you do get engaged, the outmoded concept flapped like a late butterfly in the night air. Or even if you don't, stay here, finish your dissertation, put in for funding for the research project. Either way, Violet pulled her knees up to her chin, wrapping her arms round her shins and dipping her head so that it rested on her knees. Do you believe in magic? She said. Ruth laughed, then, what? You're serious? Violet shrugged. I think we should stay up all night, she said. Watch the sunrise, go for breakfast just as it gets light. Very romantic, Ruth said. It's getting chilly. Violet nodded but showed no signs of moving. At last she said, there is someone. Ah, Ruth sounded amused. So, tell, Is this the man from Arkanance or that guy from London? No. So, he's a gardener. Okay. Ruth waited. Then, a gardener. At the Botanics or... No, here. Here? You mean not old... No, obviously. So who? I mean, God, you're a dark horse. How long have you been seeing him? Seeing him? Violet peered into the growing dark. Not seeing him exactly. Remember I cut my finger a couple of days ago? Well, he was there. He came to see. And? Nothing. Nothing. But you've seen him, talked to him, maybe. Well, what? Nothing. I haven't seen him since. So, then what? I don't know, but something. You mean like a fling? Ruth sounded as if she were fighting disapproval. I can see a dose of serious sex might be just the thing to get old Charlie boy out of your system, but not sex, Violet said. At least, well, you could call it love. You're joking. You're supposed to be an intelligent woman. You can't just see someone and fall in love. Not in the real world, not eyes across a crowded room and all that, surely. For God's sake, Violet. Ruth jumped down onto the grass. She picked up Violet's gown and hugged it to her body. It's damp. Look, feel. She held the bundle out towards Violet, who shook her head. Listen. What? It's just fireworks. No, listen. Violet looked out along the backs. There. What? Another punch? I don't think so. No, look. With a bad grace, Ruth looked over the wall, towards the rhythmical sound of oars pulling through water. Some maniac out sculling after dark? Look, Violet said again. Coming slowly into view was a long wooden rowing boat, with what looked like a length of tarpaulin rolled up along the top of a series of hoops above the boat. It's a camping skiff, she said. They used to have them at Oxford, 3 men in a boat style. You rowed during the day, and at night you pulled a cover over like a tent and sleep in the boat. And listen, there's music. There was. Something intricate and old. Tune picked out on some stringed instrument. Guitar it might be, or a lute. A fragment here, a phrase there. Lapping in and under the wash of the water. They watched as the boat approached. Violet could make out cushions, blankets, a bottle, what might be a hamper. In the prow, is that the term? There were flowers, a profusion of roses, and honeysuckle she thought she could see. And in the centre of the boat, one oarsman, his back to them, pulling in directly below where they were standing, where he tied up and stepped out onto the bank. Oh, Violet said. Oh, gosh. Oh. He stood up. He stood, looking up, and slowly held his hand up towards her. Ruth backed away from the balustrade, still clutching the gown. You are joking, she said. You have to be joking. I thought you said this wasn't about sex. A one-night stand in a wooden boat with a man you don't know, haven't even spoken to from what I can gather. You're mad. Not sex, Violet repeated. She looked down and then back at Ruth. She was smiling. So what then? Come, Violet. At your age, you're not some naive 19-year-old. Come on, we'll go for a drink. And then, when Violet showed no sign of responding, for God's sake, grow up. It won't. You can't. It'll end in... Violet shrugged. It ends... Who knows how it ends? For now, the beginning will do. She jumped down onto the bank. You can keep the gown, she said, as he handed her into the boat and they slipped into the dark.
I'm glad I asked to hear the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
It's quite, a short story.
Carry on eating, drinking, talking for another half hour.
Oh.
Unless you want me to do a poem.
Yeah, go on.
What's that song? No, mine are rude, so.
So do you go to the observatory?
Yes,
God,
I have, yeah, I have.